Howdy, folks. My name is Scott Fisher, and welcome to the behind the scenes of my latest oil on engraved copper painting called Flutter. The first thing I did was thumbnails. Of course, I chose the one on the far right. I gathered reference and I did a drawing. This drawing took a long time, but we'll save that for another video. In this video, we're focusing on the copper painting. So the first thing I did was do laser prints in reverse of my drawing. I then did the old school technique of using an iron and laying it down on the copper and just ironing it out, and it'll transfer over. It's not the most perfect transfer ever. You'll see that stuff is missing on it, but I got the gist of it enough down that I can then redraw it. But right now I'm digging in with oil-based enamel paint. I wanted to use enamel paint because it dries fast, first of all, and it's oil to begin with, and it goes down so thick. And the one that I like to use the most is this paint called, well, it's what sign painters would use, or pinstripers would use, called Sign Painters One-Shot Lettering Enamel. It's an excellent, excellent thing. And I went ahead and I decided to fill it in because do you know how long this would take with traditional oil paint? With a sign paint, I can do it in one coat, guys, and I get to move on. I call it the gouache of oil paint because it goes down so opaque. It's just a gorgeous thing. So I painted out the design first, and you can notice I'm painting it right over my sketch. My theory was to evolve some of the things that are behind this paint later as we go through the process. This took forever. Going in between all those little lines, I don't even know what this is in real time. Ages. It was like a day just doing this, I felt like. Getting a little bit more accurate, of course, as we get towards the figure. And I even just chose to use one color because I'm going to do painting on top of this, and I thought, well, if I just use the base color, it'll be great. I wanted those negative gaps to be in there because I want the light to be able to hit the copper and reflect back later through the paint that's glazed over. But then I went into the bird. I'm still staying with the enamel paint here. I'm watering it down with a little bit of mineral spirits at first and painting it up really chunky. Again, I want a base of oil paint on there to be able to paint on later, and I want it to dry fast. Now we're doing the first base coat on the outfit, and as you're going to see in a second, what I'm going to wind up starting to do, well, there's a little wipeout technique. That's the other great thing about oil. I was able to use a drawing stub and just wipe out where I didn't want that paint, and the oil, of course, stays fluid long enough for you to get it off. But because it's enamel, it is going to dry pretty fast, so I do have to be timely with this, but certainly better than using acrylic at this stage for that kind of thing. Now we're doing much more broad marks, going right over the enamel with this blue, right over the figure. I wanted this diagonal mark making to happen to really put this whole thing in motion. I'm lifting out into it. I'm using, the drawing stub, dry brushes, all sorts of things to just kind of get this streaky vibe going on throughout the piece. And it's funny because the enamel would kind of close back up and blend in again. So I wound up having to rework it and rework it and rework it because the medium that was in there. Put the base coats on the hair. Tightening up the drawing that got lost in the transfer. This is the only drawing I've done on the surface so far. I used a mixture of FW ink, even a little ballpoint pen, which sticks really well to this kind of stuff for some reason. And this is just me tightening it up. That was FW acrylic ink there. That is the only part of this painting that isn't oil. And again, I just wanted it to dry super fast, so we tightened all that up. Okay, now we're starting to use paint. Even the base coat of the flesh here is still enamel. I'm mixing the enamel. I've got a whole palette of it going, and I'm using a sponge to sponge it on top. That's a simple wedge makeup sponge, and it's almost like if you were, I don't want to say airbrushing, but something like that, where I'm just trying to get a smushy middle value there. And the reason I want to coat the entire figure is because of this stage. So now I'm going to actually start painting on it with oil paint. And what I didn't want to happen was the copper to reflect so brightly that when you view it from different angles, the figure would look unfinished because the bright reflection would make it look like the strokes were incomplete. And the reason that happens is because copper is a middle value, so as you're looking at it, you're doing it as middle value. I'm using Gamblin Fast Matte oil paint at this stage, and for the rest of the painting, that's what I'll be using. tightening up the figure here. As we're going through it, my reference is off to the left, of course, so my eyes are just consistently just darting back and forth between the reference and what I'm painting. I'm always trying to work the edges, so I'll paint a little something, and then usually I'll go into the whatever the negative space behind that thing is, which can kind of blend the edges a little bit in areas. So things don't kind of, I don't want things to feel like they have an overall, like it was all stamped on there with a cookie cutter. There's the palette that I use, and if you pause it there, you can see exactly what paints we're actually putting to use. But it's a mirror. I use a mirror for a palette. I don't know why, I always have for a while. It's sort of, I guess it's kind of a middle value. And this is just the long trek, my friends, of render. And it's tiny little bits of paint, because you got to remember, look how small this face is. I had to use some pretty tiny brushes to do this. And the rendering technique here is almost like cross-hatching. It's almost like I'm cross-hatching lighter and lighter values towards my highlights with the paint. And of course, it's blending with what's underneath. I'm using my go-to Robert Simmons white sable liners there for this. Really getting in tight now, trying to chase it down, get the final bit going. Oh man, those eyes were driving me nuts for the longest time. I kept reworking them, walking away, reworking them. Back down on the leg. This is a bit chunkier painting. I'm using a Filbert here. I don't even know what brand it is, Princeton or something really cheap. It doesn't really matter. Because this is an accurate work. This is more like, I am enjoying the Filbert a little bit more. I used to only use the flat or the liner. I like the Filbert because the rounded edges does fan a little bit and blend a little bit as we go through this. But, you know, I've got a whole transition of color that I'm using there. And I'm just able to pick on my palette and go in and rework it. Pick my palette, go in and rework it. Now I'm doing some bigger, aggressive brush marks. And sometimes I work in a deconstructive way where I'll paint a nice edge on something, and then I'll go in with like the background color and just go whack and just knock it over the entire edge of it, blending it in. I wanted the energy, those waves of energy to kind of flow right through the figure. Hey man, now we're going to start having real fun because this is on copper. So that's using like a light chalk pencil. And obviously I'm measuring out a grid here, and there's a reason we're doing this. And part of that was all that work I did in the beginning going around the design. Well, my design got a little wonky and wacky as it went and as I filled it in with that tan paint in the beginning. And I wanted the design to be super consistent because this design is actually pretty important, and you'll know why in a little bit. But so it's a grid. I'm doing a grid on top of the paint. Of course, it's well dry at this point. It's probably been sitting for a couple days. And I get out the templates, and we start going to town. This is a specific pattern that I'm doing here. And I didn't mind if the pattern broke up in areas. That was fine, but for most of it, I wanted it to be pretty consistent. Using the template to engrave with it's such a help to try to pull these curves, especially repetitive, really similar curves, without something like a template is really tough, man. If you're trying to freehand this, it's tough. This was almost like a strobe light because my head keeps popping in the way, so you'll have to forgive me for that. And it's vibrating like this, and I apologize for it, but that's how much pressure I'm putting on this in order to make these engravings. So I'm engraving right down through the painting in areas like over the foot there, dude. We're going, right over the paint. So all that work I did, again, deconstructive, I'm kind of just destroying a lot of that work I did and working my way around this piece. Objects are great. I keep all sorts of things. I don't throw anything away almost. No, I kid you, but or my wife might not actually find that funny. But because of this, I needed a shape. Oh my gosh, this thing worked out great for 2 circles because trying to freehand with the amount of pressure it takes to engrave these lines would not be fun. But look at that. Now we're getting a tuna fish can. This is recycling in action, friends. And then whatever it takes, man, to get the mark you make. You got to find the tools that'll get the job done. And sometimes we have to be inventive, There's lots of little hatch work going on. I'm considering how light is going to hit this. And now there's all these little lines cutting across horizontally the lines around the bird. And of course, they're going to catch light differently than the other areas that were engraved, more like a normal along with the curve, like following the curve. So those lines are against the curve. But that made me feel like I had to go back and rework some of the other stuff. I mean, it is a labor-intensive process to do this, as you can imagine. Now there's a little flower design inside every other one of those shapes that you see there. So I'm doing a tiny little circle, guys, and I'm just going in one at a time and getting the job done. Also, you'll notice that my engraving around the legs is much heavier. There's much more lines, it's much thicker. And then as you get out to the edge of the painting, it's like very thin line. That template there was just for the leaves, and there we go. So now I had the main flower, and now we're doing the leaves. One at a time, working our way down the grid. My poor templates, you can imagine they take a lot of abuse in this studio. That one's pretty hazard, man. Oh my goodness. Okay, guys, time to start working towards the final painting here. After I did the engraving, then I knew I needed to work my values a little bit more. I wanted to work on the bird more. The bird's even going to get another pass on it. Here we go. Prior to that, the bird was still the enamel stage, and now we're painting the bird with the oil paint, normal oil paint. A lot of this is being done with the number 6 liner brush from Robert Simmons. Some more broad mark making. I consider this sort of like global mark making, where I'm considering the entire piece as I make these marks. And of course, as I narrow down into the bird, then it's much smaller. There was a little bit of spattering that happened there too. If you rewind a sec, you'll see where it ate away the paint. Getting the flow of the hair down finally. The final mark making on the face, as if I wasn't done before. I got to go one more pass. Same thing on the bird. The brush is just darting all over the place. It's you make a mark and an action needs a reaction. So you make a mark somewhere and then that tells you, oh, I got to make a mark here. Oh, I got to make a mark here. Wanted to get some more warmth on that bird, so we're going on him again. I felt like I had gotten him too green at that point. Much smaller brush, probably the number 1 liner for those final details on the face. Layered, 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 slow buildup is what this is. Trying to decide what strokes you want to kind of fade out and then what strokes you want to stand out a little bit more. But you can see up the arm there, especially towards the elbow, you can see some of the line rendering that's been done, the cross hatching. I felt like the piece needed more on the bottom, so I basically took a shot of my painting, put it into Photoshop, and came up with a design. I rubbed pastel on the back of the design, and now I'm transferring it on top of my painting. I didn't plan this before. This just happened right then and there. Got a big template. Gotta love that guy. If you gotta do those big circles, holy cow. And the littler template. There's the tuna can again. And guess what else we break out? Right there. See how I told you I never throw anything away? I've had that Play-Doh container for decades. I don't know. I was so glad I had it too. Go ahead and we're engraving the feather now. I'm using a brush to brush away my, the flecks of copper because I don't want them to embed into the paint or scratch the surface too much. So that's what I generally do. Sometimes I hit it with my hand, but I've learned over time that I need to do that. It's cool to see that area because you can see the texture, man. There's just all this cool texture. I must be using the sponge to clean up the edges where I engraved it. But if you think about it, this is very much like layers in Photoshop. I'm always thinking that way. Photoshop has changed my brain, and I'm constantly thinking in layers and being able to peer through. Like having the decision to do the engraving on top of the foot, man. I mean, you do a nice foot painting, you don't want to cover it up, but I thought the piece would be much better and you get much more feeling of depth if I did that and have it travel over. Kept going back and back into the feathers, of course, brushing off the dust. Now we're actually engraving some global engraving. So this is engraving through the paint, around the border, around the outside. where it cuts across her body a little bit there. I wanted her torso to kind of break up almost, you know what I mean? Almost like it was coming apart with the energy wave that's kind of flowing through this piece. Some bigger moves. I know I'm getting close to the end at this point. I can feel it. I see the light at the end of the tunnel, as I usually tell my wife when I go upstairs. Okay, the final rendering. This is the last bit, man. Wanted to get a little bit of that green that's in the bird into the hair. You know, I like to move color around a little bit. Use a big spot of it here, a little spot of it somewhere else to balance things out. It's cool. Look how the brush forked. Do you see that? The brush split, and I was able to use that split brush to pull almost like 2 strokes at once. It's a really neat thing. Painting the bird for the 3rd time there. Working the eyes again, working the whole face again. And here we go, varnish time. Hooray. Oh my gosh. Finally, at varnish time, we're buttoning this piece up. So excited to get to this stage because that means I'm really done. And that's the final piece. But here's what's really cool. The reason I did that design is because I have this frame. This is an antique, hand-tiled, hand-painted frame. And if you notice, the design in the frame is the design I spent all that time engraving into the painting. And this walkthrough just shows you how a copper painting will change based on where you're standing. It's a kind of art that can only be experienced in person, which in this day of digital reproductions and wonderful reproductions, it's nice to make something that really, yeah, if you're not standing in front of it, you're really not going to get the full dose of what it's possible to see on this. Look at that highlight behind the face. Anyway, folks, I appreciate you spending some time with me. This is the end of the walkthrough. Obviously, we got the frame on the wall. So you guys be well, keep painting, and keep being inventive.